Why would a species so easily erased by hunger, winter, flood, or war spend its strength raising stone that could outlive kingdoms, languages, even belief itself? That question hangs over the oldest monuments like mist over a sleeping valley. So much of ancient life vanished without a sound. Voices, tools, faces, prayers, yet certain walls remained, patient and unblinking, as if they were built for witnesses who had not been born yet. Before this long night of history begins to unfold, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet journey is truly something you enjoy, and if you feel like it, share your location and local time below, so the darkness can gather us from many distant places at once. There is something quietly unsettling about the oldest surviving structures on Earth, not simply their age, and not only the labour they demanded, but the strange mismatch between the fragility of the people who built them and the stubborn endurance of what they left behind. Ancient human lives were often short. Entire communities could be undone by drought, disease, failed harvests, shifting rivers, or the violence of another tribe or king. Children were buried before their names had hardened into memory. Fires consumed homes built of reed, timber, clay, and hope. One generation could disappear so completely that even its stories dissolved into rumour. And yet, from within that uncertainty, certain people chose to quarry stone, drag impossible weight across land, fit blocks with obsessive care, and build as though they were arguing with time itself. That choice has never been fully explained by utility alone. A hut must endure the season. A storehouse must endure the winter. A wall may endure a siege. But some ancient structures seem to have been built with a different horizon in mind, one far stranger than survival. They were not only shelters, and not merely displays of wealth. Many were placed where they would be seen by the sky, as much as by the living. Many were raised in silence-prone landscapes, where wind could move through stone corridors long after the hands that shaped them had become dust. Some enclosed the dead, some aligned with stars, some stood in places too exposed, too laborious, too ceremonially charged to feel like simple pragmatism. They seem to suggest that ancient builders feared not only death, but disappearance. Archaeology, careful and disciplined, often begins with materials, dates, layers, residues. It asks what tools were used, what quarry was cut, what mortars held, what bones or ceramics remained buried nearby. This method has rescued enormous stretches of the human past from fantasy. It has shown, again and again, that ancient people were not primitive dreamers stumbling through darkness, but capable observers of landscape, season, geometry, and organized labor. And yet, even when stones are measured and carbon dated, the deeper motive often remains just beyond reach. A structure can be described precisely and still remain inwardly mysterious. One may know when a monument was raised, and still not know why a society chose permanence over ease. The question becomes heavier when one notices how much else failed to survive. Textiles rot, wood softens, leather collapses into the soil. Spoken language breaks apart faster than bone. Names once uttered with reverence vanish, unless they are carved, copied, or absorbed into later traditions. Entire cosmologies can disappear while the platform of a sanctuary remains under open sky. It is possible that what survives gives a distorted portrait of the past. Perhaps ancient humanity did not only build in stone, but built in thousands of subtler forms that were simply less fortunate in their struggle against time. Still, that does not erase the psychological force of the monuments that remain. Those builders knew other materials, they knew what weather does, they knew what fire takes, and still, at certain moments, they chose the slowest and most stubborn substance they could command. This begins to feel less like architecture and more like testimony. At sites such as Göbekli Tepe, where carved pillars rose long before settled urban civilization took familiar shape, scholars have debated ritual, feasting, symbolic order, and the social power of shared labour. At Stonehenge, where phases of building stretched across generations, stone seems to carry not a single purpose, but an accumulation of meanings: funerary, ceremonial, astronomical, territorial. In Egypt, the pyramids still force modern observers into the uncomfortable position of staring at overwhelming endurance and asking whether tomb, state theatre, cosmic instrument, and theological machine may all have been true at once. None of these places prove a hidden civilization or forbidden history on their own. But they do reveal a pattern. Ancient people repeatedly invested staggering effort into structures designed to resist forgetting. And perhaps forgetting had already become their enemy. This is where history begins to blur into something older and more instinctive. Long before written archives, human groups lived close to catastrophe. Rivers changed course, seas rose after the Ice Age, grasslands failed, volcanoes darkened skies, communities migrated, merged, vanished. In such a world, memory was not a luxury, memory was survival. Which valley floods, which star returns before the rains, which ancestor founded the law, which burial place must not be disturbed, which god must be fed. Oral tradition could carry these things, but oral tradition is vulnerable to interruption. A famine can break a lineage of storytellers. A conquest can silence a priesthood. A plague can erase the keepers of a calendar in a single season. Stone, by contrast, waits. So the first great monuments may not have been built only to impress the living. They may have been built because the living had already learned how easily knowledge can vanish. That possibility changes the emotional temperature of the past. It means ancient builders were not merely ambitious. They may have been haunted. Their monuments may have risen from an awareness that the human mind leaks, that memory distorts, that descendants forget promises, alignments, origins, warnings. What if durability was not vanity, at least not at first, but anxiety made visible? What if the earliest long-lasting structures were acts of resistance against erasure? Not resistance in the military sense, but resistance in the quiet, desperate sense of placing a mark in the world that weather itself would struggle to silence. Such a motive would explain why so many enduring structures seem to stand at the border between practical and sacred space. The sacred is often where a culture deposits what it cannot afford to lose: its laws, its dead, its fear of cosmic disorder, its story of beginnings, its terms of exchange with the unseen. To build those things in wood would be to trust chance. To build them in stone would be to ask the earth to remember, and yet even stone does not remember clearly. It fractures, it sinks. It is stripped, reused, renamed, built over, interpreted by conquerors, blessed by later faiths, misread by scholars, romanticized by empires, fenced by institutions. Some inscriptions are broken, some chambers are empty, some foundations suggest vanished extensions no one can reconstruct with confidence. Even the longest-lasting structures reach us incomplete, like sentences with their final words missing. That may be the deepest unease of all. Humanity built against oblivion, and oblivion still entered through the cracks. Perhaps that is why these monuments continue to disturb the imagination. They do not simply survive, they survive imperfectly, carrying both triumph and failure in the same body. They prove that ancient humans could think beyond their own lifetime, but they also reveal how much was lost despite that effort. A temple remains, but its chant is gone. A tomb remains, but the certainty surrounding death has faded. A circle of stones remains, but the exact breadth of its ceremonies has drifted beyond recall. The structure lasts for thousands of years, the meaning does not. And if meaning can perish while stone endures, then what exactly were ancient humans trying to save when they built for eternity? Their gods, their rulers, their fear, their knowledge, or a warning meant for those who would come later and mistake survival for understanding? If stone was chosen because memory could fail, Then the next question becomes more unsettling. What kind of memory did ancient people fear losing first? It may not have been the memory of kings. It may not even have been the memory of battles. Those are the kinds of things later civilizations like to carve into official history. Once writing became a tool of power. But before that long machinery of record was fully established, something else seems to have drawn human beings toward durable places. Again and again, the earliest enduring structures appear not at the centre of ordinary domestic life, but at its edge, where the visible world seems to thin and ceremony begins. This is one of the quiet riddles of prehistory. The oldest spaces built to last were often not houses. They were not kitchens, not sleeping chambers, not workshops in the simple sense. In many cases, they were places of gathering, burial, display, alignment, offering, or repetition. They were spaces where a community did something together that could not be reduced to immediate survival. Even now, that fact carries an almost uncomfortable force. One imagines a small, vulnerable population facing winter, predators, uncertainty, infant mortality, and sudden loss. Yet within that precarious life there was enough surplus attention, enough social coordination, enough inward urgency to shape rock into a lasting form for reasons that were at least partly symbolic. At first glance, this can seem irrational, but perhaps it only seems irrational because the modern world has grown used to dividing usefulness from meaning, as if the sacred were an ornament added after the real work is done. Ancient life may not have been arranged that way at all. Ritual may have been part of survival. Gathering may have held a group together when fear or hunger might otherwise break it apart. Shared acts performed in a special place may have stabilized memory, identity, and obligation more effectively than any spoken instruction passed from one uncertain season to the next. What modern language calls ceremony may once have functioned as social architecture, as necessary in its way as walls or fire. That possibility lends a different light to sites like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, where massive T-shaped pillars, some carved with animals and abstract forms, were erected by communities living before the widespread rise of agriculture in that region. Its chronology unsettled older assumptions. For a long time, the dominant image of civilization suggested that settled farming produced surplus, surplus produced hierarchy, and hierarchy eventually produced monumental religion. Yet Göbekli Tepe seemed to hint that large-scale ritual organization might have come first, or at least that the hunger to build symbolically significant spaces did not wait politely for the full administrative apparatus of later states. Some archaeologists have suggested feasting, ancestor activity, cult practice, seasonal gatherings, or social bonding as part of its role. Others remain cautious, but caution does not dissolve the strangeness. Stone was lifted and arranged there for reasons that exceeded shelter, and it was later buried, deliberately, as if secrecy itself had been built into its fate. That detail lingers in the mind. A monument raised with effort is one mystery. A monument intentionally covered is another. Burial may have been ceremonial closure. It may have marked transition, renewal, or transformed use. Still, it introduces a haunting possibility, that ancient durable structures were not always meant to be permanently visible. Some may have been intended to endure physically while moving in and out of human access. Longevity, then, was not simply about public display. It may also have concerned preservation beneath interruption, as though a culture wished to leave something intact even when its active meaning could no longer be maintained. Across Europe, long barrows, passage tombs, and stone circles suggest a related but evolving instinct. Newgrange in Ireland, older than Stonehenge and older than the Egyptian pyramids, combines burial, alignment, and enclosure in a way that still resists a simple label. Its winter solstice illumination has drawn fascination for understandable reasons. For a brief moment in the darker season, light enters the passage and reaches the inner chamber, touching a hidden space that remains sealed from ordinary daylight. Even after generations of scholarship, conservation, debate, and tourism, the emotional effect of that design remains difficult to flatten into technical description. Whatever else the builders intended, they made darkness and return visible in stone. They gave the year a chamber in which to remember itself. One begins to suspect that endurance was never merely about duration. It was about recurrence. A structure that lasts thousands of years does more than survive weather. It holds a pattern steady while human generations change around it. It becomes a fixed point against which cycles can be felt. The sun still rises where it rose. The dead are still placed where ancestors were placed. The procession still follows the same curve. The same shadow reaches the same mark. In that sense, ritual architecture may have functioned as a stabilizer of time, an anchor placed into a world otherwise experienced as uncertain and perishable. If myths shifted, if leaders died, if memory thinned, the place itself could instruct. The stone could remind bodies where to stand, when to gather, what direction to face, what sequence to repeat. That may help explain why so many early ceremonial structures combine practicality and symbolism so seamlessly that later observers struggle to separate them. A tomb preserves remains, but it also preserves relationship. A circular enclosure gathers people, but it also shapes their attention. A raised platform creates visibility, but it also transforms ordinary ground into meaningful ground. None of these functions cancel the others. The ancient mind may not have needed them separated. To preserve a ritual was to preserve social order. To preserve social order was to preserve the group's continuity with the dead, the land, and the sky. What endured in stone was not just a building, but a choreography of belonging. Still, there is another layer to the puzzle, and it is harder to approach without unease. Why do so many of these sites seem positioned between reverence and fear? Why do the earliest durable spaces so often cluster around death, thresholds, underworld imagery, animal power, or celestial events that measure darkness as much as light? It may be because permanence becomes most desirable precisely where existence feels most threatened. The urge to build against time sharpens where time wounds most visibly. A burial chamber is an answer to loss. A solstice-aligned passage is an answer to seasonal dread. A ceremonial enclosure is an answer to human dispersion. The monument does not solve mortality, but it gives mortality a shape the community can revisit, and perhaps that is where the true depth of the matter begins. Ancient people may not have built to last because they believed themselves powerful. They may have built to last because they felt the world slipping too easily into silence. Every grave would have reminded them that memory is fragile. Every storm-damaged settlement would have reminded them that wood burns, roofs collapse, and human plans are brief. In that atmosphere, stone becomes something more than matter. It becomes a wager that form can outlast forgetting, that repetition can defend meaning, that a place can hold what a lifetime cannot. But if the earliest lasting structures were built to preserve ritual and memory, another question waits just beyond them, colder than the first. Why did so many of those spaces gather around the dead, as if the secret of endurance had always been whispered first by a tomb? The dead may have taught ancient humanity how to think in stone. That possibility carries a weight that is difficult to ignore. If the earliest durable structures gathered people around ritual, then the next circle inward leads almost inevitably toward burial, toward the strange and ancient conviction that something about a human life must be protected even after breath has withdrawn. Across continents and across eras that never touch one another directly, communities separated by oceans, climate, and language returned to a similar impulse. They dug chambers, they raised mounds, they aligned passages, they sealed bones with care, they enclosed the dead in architecture more enduring than the homes of the living. It is one of the oldest contradictions in human history. Those who slept in impermanent dwellings often built permanence for the silent. At first glance, the explanation seems simple. Grief preserves, love labours. A family does not easily leave its dead exposed to animals, weather, and oblivion. But that answer, though true in part, does not fully explain the scale or design of ancient mortuary architecture. A modest grave protects a body. A megalithic tomb, a carefully aligned burial chamber, or an enormous funerary complex does something else. It places death inside an order. It suggests that the dead were not merely gone, but positioned. They were situated within a pattern that mattered to the living, and perhaps to powers beyond the living. Stone, in this sense, became not only protection, but translation. A way of carrying a human absence into a form the world could continue to hold. This may be why tombs so often feel older than history itself, even when their dates are known. They seem to belong to a layer of thought beneath politics, beneath doctrine, beneath empire. A ruler's monument may boast, a state archive may record. But a burial structure reveals something more primitive and more enduring, the refusal to let death end relationship. That refusal does not have to mean sentimental attachment in the modern sense. In many ancient societies, the dead remained socially active. Ancestors could bless, judge, warn, legitimize, contaminate, or protect. Their presence could stabilize the land claims of descendants, confirm ritual authority, or bind a lineage to a place. To bury the dead well was therefore not only to honor memory, it was to maintain a channel, and a channel once broken could bring disorder. This thought lingers around Neolithic chambered tombs, around passage graves, around collective burials that suggest not isolated mourning, but long-term communal investment. In places like Maeshowe in Orkney, Newgrange in Ireland, or the great mound traditions found in multiple parts of the world, burial architecture seems to do more than conceal the dead from sight. It creates a boundary that must be crossed deliberately. Darkness deepens, space narrows, orientation matters, sound changes. One moves inward, away from weather and ordinary life, into an interior set apart from common time. Such design does not feel accidental. It feels ritualized, as though the architecture itself were teaching the living how to approach absence. That instructional quality may be central to the puzzle. A tomb can preserve a corpse, but it can also preserve behavior. It tells descendants where to bring offerings, where to pause, where to lower their voices, where to remember names, where to feel fear. Even when exact beliefs are lost, the structure continues to guide movement and emotion. Stone educates long after explanation fades. In this way, mortuary architecture may have served as one of the earliest forms of social continuity, a durable script written not in letters but in passageways, chambers, thresholds, and light. Light, perhaps, was never incidental. When scholars describe solar alignments in tombs and ceremonial chambers, the language can sometimes become technical, almost overly neat. Yet behind the measurements lies something far more intimate. To guide the sun into a dark chamber on a specific day is not merely an astronomical trick. It is an act of emotional engineering. It means someone cared enough to bind the dead to recurrence, to make hidden space answer to the heavens. Whether the meaning involved rebirth, royal legitimacy, seasonal renewal, or cosmic order, the effect is unmistakable. The tomb ceases to be only a container. It becomes a stage on which time itself performs. The dead are no longer simply buried. They are placed within a rhythm larger than decay. In ancient Egypt, this instinct reached a scale that still unsettles modern imagination. The pyramids can be described in administrative terms: labour organisation, state power, quarry logistics, political theology, elite burial practice, and all of that is necessary. Yet such explanations only trace the outer shell of the matter. A pyramid is too excessive to be only practical. It is a mountain made intentional. It is a body transformed into geometry. It is a funerary form that rejects the ordinary proportions of grief and enters the realm of metaphysical insistence. The pharaoh's death did not merely require remembrance, it required orientation within the cosmos. The structure itself declared that mortality, at least for certain bodies, could be managed through permanence, scale, and celestial relationship. And still, for all their endurance, these structures keep secrets badly and incompletely. Chambers are emptied, names are chiseled away, grave goods are stolen, ritual texts fracture. The body can survive in one sense and vanish in another. This failure matters. It suggests that ancient mortuary architecture was not simply confident. Beneath its grandeur may have lived anxiety, even desperation. Why else build so heavily around death unless death threatened to dissolve more than flesh? Why else seal, align, layer, conceal, and monumentalize unless something essential was thought to be at risk? Perhaps what was at risk was not only the individual, but continuity itself. A community that forgets its dead forgets its own claims about origin, duty, and place. Ancestors often stand behind law, inheritance, ritual sequence, and moral order. If the dead disappear into anonymity, the living become easier to unmoor. They can be displaced, redefined, absorbed. This is why the destruction or desecration of tombs has so often accompanied conquest. To disturb the dead is to disturb memory at its foundation. To seize the burial landscape is to interrupt a people's relationship with time. Ancient builders may have understood that with painful clarity. They may have known, long before modern archives, that a society survives partly by deciding where its dead remain present. That may also explain why some tombs seem designed as if they were archives without writing. A chamber preserves bones, yes, but it also preserves arrangement. A mound preserves orientation. A sarcophagus preserves rank, image, symbolism. Burial goods preserve fragments of trade, technology, hierarchy, and belief. Even absence preserves something. An empty tomb still testifies that someone believed this place mattered enough to rob. In that sense, mortuary architecture records by enduring. It stores not only remains, but relationships, priorities, and thresholds of meaning. And yet one cannot escape a more troubling thought. What if some of these structures were built not simply to honour the dead, but to protect the living from forgetting something the dead carried with them? A lineage, perhaps, a covenant, a map of heaven, a warning. The idea sounds speculative, but history repeatedly shows how burial sites became centres of identity, pilgrimage, political legitimacy, and contested memory. The dead did not merely belong to the past, they were used to govern the future. So the first great architecture of endurance may not have begun with kings showing power, but with communities fearing rupture. A tomb lasts because relationship must last. A chamber survives because memory cannot be trusted to the mouth alone. The dead are placed in stone because human thought, left to wind and inheritance, drifts too easily away from its beginnings. And once a culture begins building permanence around the dead, another possibility emerges like a shadow behind the chamber wall. If stone can preserve a body, a lineage, a ritual, and a claim to truth, then it can do the same for gods. Once stone begins to guard the dead, it is only a small step before it is asked to guard something even less visible. Gods do not decay in the ordinary sense, yet their presence has always seemed vulnerable to neglect, interruption, and disbelief. Ancient people may have feared many things: famine, invasion, eclipse, plague. But beneath those immediate dangers was another, quieter terror. That the order holding the world together might weaken if memory, ritual, and sacred proportion were allowed to drift. A tomb preserves the relationship between the living and the dead. A temple, more strangely, preserves the relationship between the visible world and whatever it believed hovered just beyond it. That may be why some of the most enduring ancient structures were not houses for people at all, but houses for powers no one could prove in the modern sense, yet no one felt safe ignoring. Here the mystery deepens. If early humans built lasting structures partly to resist forgetting, then sacred architecture suggests that forgetting was not only social or ancestral, it was cosmic. The danger was not merely that names would vanish, but that alignment itself might fail. a sanctuary oriented to the sun, a shrine placed upon a mountain, a chamber cut into bedrock, a ziggurat rising in measured stages. These were not only displays of devotion, they implied that certain forms, positions, and proportions mattered. They suggested that architecture could become a medium through which order was invited, stabilized, or renewed. It is easy, from a modern distance, to reduce such things to symbolism, as though symbols were decorative ideas placed on top of a more practical reality. Ancient sacred spaces seem to resist that simplification. In many cultures, there was no clean separation between the symbolic and the functional. A temple did not merely represent cosmic order, it participated in it. It gave it a location, a routine, a body. Priests walked prescribed paths. Offerings were made at measured intervals. Statues were washed, fed, clothed, hidden, revealed. Thresholds regulated who could approach and how far. This does not feel like ornamental religion added to an otherwise ordinary society. It feels like a deliberate attempt to bind invisible relationships to durable matter. And durable matter has its own language. Stone carries weight, resists fire, endures flood better than timber, and remains legible long after softer substances fail. But beyond physical resilience, it conveys a kind of moral seriousness. A sacred order built in wood may be sincere. A sacred order built in stone feels sworn. Perhaps ancient builders understood this instinctively. Perhaps they knew that a god asked to dwell in temporary materials might seem temporary as well, too exposed to weather, politics, and indifference. To build a sanctuary in stone was to declare that what occurred there was not seasonal improvisation, but part of the world's deep structure. This becomes especially visible in civilizations where temple construction was inseparable from kingship and cosmology. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat rose not as a simple meeting hall, but as an artificial mountain, a staged elevation linking city, ruler, priesthood, and heavens. The temple complex was often the administrative, economic, and ritual center at once, making it impossible to cleanly divide practical governance from sacred purpose. Grain, labor, offerings, calculation, and prayer converged in the same architectural body. Such places were not durable only because rulers wanted prestige. They lasted because the system itself depended on visible permanence. To keep the gods near, to keep the city ordered, to keep legitimacy intact, there had to be a place that seemed more stable than the people moving through it. In Egypt, the union of sacred geometry and durability becomes even more haunting. The temples along the Nile do not merely occupy space, they choreograph approach. Colonnades compress and release. Axes direct the eye inward. Reliefs bind ritual action to stone surfaces. Light diminishes as one moves toward deeper chambers, as if the building were training the body to leave the ordinary world behind. Even when their exact rites are no longer fully recoverable, these structures retain intention in their bones. One does not stand inside them with the feeling that they were casually assembled. They seem measured against a conception of reality that exceeded any single reign. Perhaps that is why geometry enters the story so persistently. Proportion has always occupied a strange place between the practical and the metaphysical. It is measurable, yet it also carries an aura of inevitability, as if certain forms feel right because they mirror relations already present in nature, music, the heavens, or the body. Ancient builders across different civilizations returned again and again to cardinal directions, solar events, repeated ratios, elevated platforms, enclosed centers, and ceremonial axes. It would be careless to flatten all these choices into one grand hidden theory. Yet it would also be naive to pretend they were random. A durable sacred building was often a way of freezing order into matter, so that even a disrupted community could return to a pattern that claimed to be older than opinion. And that claim to age matters. The more uncertain a society feels, the more powerful it becomes to say that its rituals are not inventions but inheritances. A temple in stone silently tells its visitors that what happens here existed before them and should continue after them. It transforms belief into environment. A person entering such a space does not merely hear doctrine. The person feels scale, shadow, orientation, acoustics, precession, distance from sunlight, and the pressure of crafted surfaces meant to endure. Belief becomes architectural weather. This may be one reason sacred structures were built to last even when ordinary dwellings were not. Homes answer daily need. Temples answer the more dangerous question of whether reality itself remains trustworthy. Still, another possibility darkens the edges of this story. What if some of these structures were built not only to maintain contact with the divine, but to preserve a sacred knowledge already felt to be under threat? Priesthoods do not arise in a vacuum. They inherit calendars, chants, measurements, myths, sequences of offering, ideas of purity, and rules of access. All of that can be lost. A disrupted temple system can break chains of transmission that may have taken centuries to refine. In this light, a long-lasting sanctuary becomes something close to an archive without paper. Its walls preserve order through space. Its alignments preserve order through light. Its thresholds preserve order through movement. Even stripped of text, it can teach fragments of its own logic to those who come after. But teaching is not the same as clarity. Many ancient sacred structures survive while their meanings remain contested. Was a chamber initiatory, funerary, astronomical, political? Was a platform for sacrifice, enthronement, procession, or all three? Did a particular alignment mark a calendrical event, a mythic event, or a royal one? Scholars debate carefully, and rightly so. Yet the persistence of uncertainty is itself revealing. These buildings were constructed to last, but not necessarily to explain themselves to distant strangers. Their original users may have relied on oral instruction, embodied ritual, and controlled access. Once those were broken, the architecture remained like a lock without its key. Endurance preserved the shell, but not the full code. This may be where the unease returns most sharply. Ancient humans may have built sacred structures that last thousands of years, not because they were certain of eternity, but because they were not. Stone becomes necessary when the invisible seems unstable, when memory frays, when contact with origins feels endangered. A temple is then more than a devotional site. It is defense against drift. It is a claim that there is a pattern beneath chaos, and that pattern can be held, at least for a while, in weight, angle, darkness, and return. Yet if temples were built to preserve cosmic order, one must ask what kind of world would make such preservation feel urgent. Reverence alone does not always build on that scale. Sometimes what builds on that scale is the memory of destruction. Reverence can explain devotion. It cannot always explain urgency. There is a different atmosphere surrounding some of the world's oldest enduring structures, one harder to name and more difficult to prove. It is the atmosphere of aftermath, as though certain monuments were not raised in the innocence of a civilization simply celebrating itself, but in the shadow of something already lost. Not every stone circle, platform, pyramid, or temple needs to be tied to catastrophe. History is full of gradual development, local innovation, and patient cultural growth. Yet when one listens closely to the oldest myths that gathered around floodwaters, fire from the sky, vanished lands, divine anger, drowned cities, or ages of humanity destroyed and renewed, a quiet pattern begins to emerge. Ancient people often remembered the world as breakable. Some remembered it as repeatedly broken. That memory matters because architecture changes when a culture no longer trusts continuity. A people that feels secure may build for function, beauty, prestige, or worship. A people haunted by rupture may build for transmission. The structure no longer serves only the present. It becomes a vessel meant to survive interruption. That possibility, once considered, begins to cast a strange light over many long-lasting ancient works. Why choose immense stone over more flexible materials? Why return obsessively to elevation, enclosure, cardinal orientation, and foundation depth? Why place sacred or political meaning into forms capable of outliving storms, dynasties, and perhaps even memory itself? Perhaps because memory had failed before. Perhaps because oral continuity had once been broken by events too vast for a single lifetime to absorb. The end of the last ice age offers a sober, non-mythic background for such thoughts. Rising sea levels transformed coastlines across the world. Landscapes that once held camps, pathways, or early settlements were submerged. Rivers changed course. Ecological zones shifted. What had been habitable plains in one era became seabeds in another. Modern archaeology has only begun to reckon with how much early human life may now lie beneath water, inaccessible or erased. If coastlines often attract settlement, trade, ritual, and dense memory, then the drowning of those coasts would not merely remove houses, it would sever inherited maps of the world. It would turn ancestral ground into myth. A later generation, hearing of lost places beneath the sea, might not remember exact dates or mechanisms, but it could preserve the emotional truth that the earth itself had once taken something back. Flood myths, so widespread and so persistent, have often tempted grand speculation. Some of that speculation runs too quickly, flattening separate traditions into a single literal event. Caution is necessary. But caution does not erase the deeper significance of the pattern. From Mesopotamia to the Eastern Mediterranean, from South Asia to indigenous traditions elsewhere, stories of overwhelming waters, destruction, survival, and renewal recur with unusual force. They may reflect local floods, inherited memory of post-glacial change, theological imagination, political appropriation, or all of these at once. What matters here is not proving one universal flood. What matters is noticing that many societies imagine themselves living after a break. The world had not simply begun and continued, it had been interrupted. A civilization that believes interruption is possible begins to build differently. In that light, endurance is no longer just vanity or piety. It becomes insurance against another silence. A monument may be designed to remain standing after forests burn, after roofs fall, after settlements scatter. A temple on elevated ground may be more than symbolic ascent. It may reflect a practical and emotional preference for surviving terrain. Deep foundations may not only stabilize weight, they may express a culture's distrust of shifting surface life. Even the choice to encode significance in alignments, proportions, and stone reliefs may imply a wish to preserve knowledge in forms harder to distort than speech. This does not require belief in a vanished super-civilization. Ordinary human fear is enough. Communities exposed to seasonal danger, geological violence, or inherited stories of destruction do not need forbidden technology to think long. They need only memory, especially wounded memory. And wounded memory does curious things. It compresses centuries into legends. It preserves fear more clearly than chronology. It turns practical warnings into sacred narratives. A shoreline lost to rising water becomes a tale of divine judgment. A volcanic winter becomes an age of darkness. A migration forced by drought becomes the exile of a chosen people. None of this is fabrication in the simple sense. It is memory translated into forms that can survive emotional truth when precise detail is gone. Architecture may have been one such form. There is a reason so many ancient durable structures stand where sky and land feel exposed to each other. Hills, plateaus, ridges, desert margins, river edges, promontories. These are places where the world appears larger than human life. They also happen to be places from which danger can be seen, tracked, ritualized, or remembered. Some sites may have chosen height for visibility, holiness, political theatre, or astronomical clarity. Yet it is difficult to ignore how often elevation also answers catastrophe. The raised place watches. The raised place survives longer. The raised place holds meaning even when the lower world is altered. One begins to wonder whether some monumental landscapes were shaped by people already conscious of having inherited fragments. Not pristine beginnings, but remnants. This would explain the melancholy that sometimes clings to ancient building traditions. A later temple built over an earlier shrine, a megalithic site reused by a new culture, a sacred mountain with layers of ritual from civilizations that no longer share a language. Such continuity is impressive, but it is also evidence of repeated forgetting. Each generation preserves and transforms at once. Each inherits a place whose full origin it may no longer fully understand. The monument stays. The explanation shifts. That shifting explanation is where official history often enters. Later priesthoods, dynasties, empires, and religions do not simply discover ancient sites. They interpret them, rename them, absorb them, or suppress earlier meanings. What had once been a local ancestral place becomes a royal sanctuary. What had once marked a celestial cycle becomes proof of imperial legitimacy. What had once belonged to one cosmology is folded into another. This does not always happen through conscious deception. Sometimes it is simply what continuity looks like after rupture. But sometimes power does prefer the inherited stone to speak in its own voice. The older the monument, the easier it becomes to place a new story inside it. Perhaps that is why so many enduring ancient structures feel like palimpsests rather than clear messages. They have survived not because their meanings stayed intact, but because their physical authority invited reuse. Each age writes over the last, leaving traces, fractures, and contradictions, and still the stones remain, quietly older than the explanations forced upon them. So the question becomes darker. Maybe ancient humans built structures that last thousands of years because they had already seen how thoroughly worlds can be erased. Not just homes or rulers, but coastlines, rituals, names, calendars, and entire ways of imagining time. A monument, then, is not optimism in stone, it is caution in stone. It is a civilization whispering to the future that continuity cannot be trusted. And once the fear of rupture enters architecture, another motive follows close behind it. If the world can be broken, and memory can be rewritten after every break, then those who build to last may not only be preserving truth, they may also be trying to control which truth survives. Once a structure is built to outlast disaster, it begins to acquire another power, quieter and more dangerous than endurance itself. It can instruct the future without asking permission. That possibility changes the mood of the ancient world yet again. A monument that survives for centuries is one thing. A monument that survives long enough to shape the imagination of people who no longer know its builders is something else entirely. At that point, stone ceases to be only memory. It becomes authority. It begins to tell later generations where meaning resides, where power once stood, where the sacred may still linger, where the horizon should be measured, where bodies should gather, where eyes should turn. And if the builders understood even dimly that this might happen, then some ancient structures were not merely built to endure time, they were built to govern time. The simplest way to feel this is to think about alignment. Across the ancient world, enduring structures were often placed or oriented in ways that seemed to bind them to recurring celestial events. Solstice light entering a chamber, an axis pointing towards sunrise or sunset on a significant day, walls or openings that frame a star, a lunar standstill, or a shifting line on the horizon. Not every claim of astronomical alignment is persuasive. Some are exaggerated, some are retrofitted by modern enthusiasm. Yet enough examples remain credible to make the broader pattern difficult to dismiss. Ancient builders repeatedly placed long-lasting architecture into conversation with the sky. This matters because the sky is the oldest clock humanity ever knew. Before writing, Before mechanical devices, before stable archives, human beings already lived beneath a system of recurrence vast enough to humble every individual life. The sun returned, the moon altered its face, certain stars rose before rains or cold, seasons approached not as abstractions but as conditions of hunger, movement, and survival. To observe these cycles carefully was not a luxury. It was a way of staying alive. But observation alone is not the whole story. The deeper question is why some societies encoded these cycles in stone, in forms durable enough to remain legible long after the original observers were gone. Perhaps oral tradition was not enough. A spoken calendar can drift. A priesthood can be interrupted. A migration can break inherited knowledge. A war can silence those who know when to plant, when to harvest, when to mourn, when to expect floodwater, when to mark the turning of the year. But a chamber that fills with light only at a particular dawn does not depend entirely on memory. A standing stone casting a specific shadow does not need a surviving manuscript to perform its lesson. The monument itself becomes the teacher. It says, without words, that this moment matters. Return here. Watch this line. Wait for this light. Remember this order. In that sense, durable architecture may have functioned as an external memory system for societies living close to uncertainty. It stored temporal knowledge outside the vulnerable body. What a person forgot, the horizon could restore. What one generation neglected, the monument could patiently repeat. This is not as dramatic as hidden codes or secret machines, but it may be more profound. It suggests that stone was used not simply to preserve dead matter, but to stabilize relationship with recurring time. The monument became a witness more reliable than recollection. This gives certain ancient sites an almost unsettling serenity. They seem to wait not only for visitors but for events, a beam of light arriving in darkness, a sunrise falling into the same architectural corridor it has entered for centuries, a shadow touching the same mark after countless human births and deaths. One begins to understand why such places could feel alive to those who used them, not alive in the crude sense of movement, but alive in the sense of answering. The world returns to them. The heavens acknowledge them. They do not merely occupy time, they participate in its rhythm, and rhythm is a form of power. A society that can mark the proper moment holds more than practical advantage. It holds interpretive authority. It can say when the year begins, when offerings must be made, when kingship is renewed, when fasting starts, when mourning ends, when danger is near, when a cycle is closed and another has begun. Time, once organized, becomes political and sacred at once. This may be one reason that structures tied to celestial recurrence were built to last. They anchored not only knowledge, but obedience. To gather at the appointed place under the appointed sky was to enter an order larger than preference. The monument, by enduring, made that order feel ancient even when its exact form may have been historically contingent. This is where the mystery deepens into something almost philosophical. Why were ancient humans so concerned with placing human activity inside a pattern that exceeded human life? One answer is obvious enough, because survival depended on it. But there may have been another, more inward answer. A life measured only by birth, labour, and death is fragile in a way that the human mind does not easily bear. To bind human action to celestial recurrence is to soften mortality with pattern. The individual vanishes, but the sequence remains. One generation dies, but the solstice returns to the chamber. One ruler is buried, but the star still rises where it rose before. The structure then becomes a mediator between perishable existence and impersonal continuity. Perhaps this is why so many enduring ancient sites feel neither fully funerary, nor fully observatory, neither fully temple, nor fully calendar. Those categories may be too modern, too separated. The ancient monument could be all of these at once because death, ritual, season, legitimacy, and cosmic orientation were never completely independent concerns. To preserve the calendar was to preserve the ritual. To preserve the ritual was to preserve social order. To preserve social order was to preserve the relation between ancestors, land and heavens. A durable structure could therefore hold an entire worldview inside a single arrangement of earth and stone. Still, a troubling thought lingers behind all this precision. If a monument can preserve time, it can also monopolize it. It can make one version of recurrence official while others disappear. It can establish where the true dawn is to be watched, which lineage has the right to interpret it, which ritual counts as correct, which season belongs to which authority. In this way, architecture moves from memory into control. The sky is shared by all, but the place from which its meaning is declared may belong to a few. This possibility becomes especially important once societies grow more stratified. A sacred or astronomical structure no longer merely assists communal orientation, it legitimizes hierarchy. Those who understand its cycles or preside at its thresholds can claim nearness to cosmic order itself. Stone, then, is not neutral. Its endurance lends weight to whoever can speak through it. The longer it lasts, the more natural that authority begins to seem. Later generations may forget that a system was made by human choice, and instead feel that it has always existed, because the monument has always been there. And perhaps that is the quiet genius of lasting structures. They turn historical decisions into landscapes. They make chosen meanings feel inevitable. They cause power, ritual, and time to settle into one another until separating them becomes almost impossible. Yet if some ancient humans built to preserve cycles and teach descendants how to live within them, another question begins to form at the edge of the horizon. What happens when rulers realize that a monument aligned with eternity can make their own authority seem eternal too? When stone begins to resemble eternity, power rarely stays far behind. A structure that endures beyond one lifetime does more than preserve memory. It alters scale. It pulls the human figure into disproportion. A ruler standing before a monument larger than any ordinary dwelling does not merely appear wealthy or capable. The ruler appears attached to something that exceeds the limits of the flesh. This may be one of the most consequential shifts in the history of architecture. What begins as an effort to hold ritual, ancestry, or cosmic rhythm can, in time, become a way of hardening political authority into the landscape itself. The monument does not simply survive the ruler. It teaches later generations to imagine that ruler as part of an unbroken order. This is the point at which endurance starts to become dangerous. It is one thing to build a tomb so that the dead are not forgotten, or a sanctuary so that ritual remains aligned with sky and season. It is another to use durability to make a temporary regime seem inevitable. Yet ancient history is filled with precisely this transformation. Kingdoms rise in uncertainty. Dynasties inherit lands they did not create. Empires gather peoples who do not share language, gods, or memory. In such conditions, force alone is rarely enough. Soldiers can seize territory, but they cannot by themselves create permanence. A ruler who wants obedience to feel natural must do something subtler. The ruler must persuade the future that the current order belongs to deep time. Stone is unusually good at that persuasion. Massive architecture overwhelms the ordinary imagination. It makes labour visible long after the workers are gone. It suggests organisation, command, access to resources, the ability to draw bodies together into a single will. Even when the original political context is forgotten, the structure keeps radiating these impressions. A palace platform, triumphal gate, royal tomb, fortified ceremonial road, or colossal temple complex continues to whisper that someone once possessed extraordinary power. And for those living later, especially those lacking the means to reconstruct the social conditions of its making, that whisper can become myth. Power calcifies into awe. Administration becomes legend. This may help explain why so many rulers throughout antiquity built not merely for function, but for duration. The building did useful things, certainly, It housed ritual, storage, audiences, archives, or burials. But usefulness alone does not account for the obsession with scale, foundation, visibility, and monumental material. Such choices reveal another ambition: to make authority survive interpretation, to ensure that even if the ruler's words are lost, the ruler's presence will remain embedded in stone. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples, though not the only one. The pyramids are not merely tombs. They are declarations that kingship participates in cosmic order on a scale far beyond common death. Their endurance is part of their meaning. A grave hidden in soft earth would preserve a body for a while. A pyramid visible across a landscape turns burial into political theology. It does not ask later generations to remember the pharaoh. It places the pharaoh into the horizon so forcefully that forgetting becomes difficult. Even after texts are damaged and cult practices fade, the geometry remains. Power still stands there in silence, refusing to collapse into ordinary mortality. But the Egyptian case is only one expression of a wider instinct. In Mesopotamia, kings rebuilt temples and city walls not only as acts of devotion or civic duty, but as inscriptions of legitimacy. In the ancient Near East more broadly, royal building projects often served as visible proof that order had been restored after chaos, rebellion, invasion, or dynastic uncertainty. To rebuild a sanctuary, extend a terrace, or raise a new ceremonial complex was to say, the cosmos is aligned again, and it is aligned through this reign. Architecture functioned as political argument, but one cast in a medium designed to outlast rebuttal. Rome understood this with brutal clarity. Roads, aqueducts, forums, arches, temples, amphitheatres, imperial complexes. These were never only practical achievements. They were instruments of memory, shaping conquered landscapes into Roman landscapes. Once stone and concrete imposed imperial geometry on a city, the conquest no longer seemed temporary. It became civic space. It became the route a citizen walked, the bath a body entered, the arch an army paraded through. Monumentality naturalized domination. It made rule feel built into the world. Later ruins still carry that impression. Even broken columns retain imperial posture. And yet the deeper issue is not simply propaganda. That word is too shallow for what monuments do over long spans of time. Propaganda persuades. Architecture conditions. It arranges movement, visibility, approach, weighting, and bodily relation. It teaches who stands elevated, who enters from below, who crosses thresholds, who remains outside, whose dead receive durable chambers, whose names reach walls, whose labour disappears into foundation fill. In this way, a long-lasting structure does not only communicate authority, it rehearses authority again and again until hierarchy feels spatial, almost natural. The eye learns where power belongs because the landscape has been taught to hold it there. This is where the moral unease becomes difficult to avoid. Many enduring structures admired today were raised through systems of extraction, forced labour, tribute, debt, conquest, or sharply unequal command. Their beauty and mystery do not erase that. A monument may preserve awe while concealing suffering. In fact, its endurance may help accomplish that concealment. As centuries pass, the finished form remains more visible than the lives consumed in its making. The polished stone outlives the exhausted body. The ruler's inscription survives while the anonymous labourer dissolves into soil. One begins to suspect that part of monumentality's power lies in this imbalance. It transforms many temporary human sacrifices into one durable image of order, and still it would be too simple to say that monuments are lies. They are more unsettling than lies because they are mixtures of truth and control. They truly required coordination, knowledge, skill, planning and vision. They truly did bind communities, mark landscapes and structure time. But they also selected what would be remembered and what would be buried beneath the remembered thing. This selection may be the hidden engine of historical permanence. Not everything can survive. So those with power attempt to decide which forms will carry forward and which lives will disappear beneath them. Once that is understood, the monument changes again in the mind. It is no longer only a surviving artifact of ancient intent, it is a filter. It passes certain meanings into the future while obstructing others. It may preserve the name of a king while losing the songs of the workers. It may preserve a state cult while obscuring the older shrine on which it was built. It may preserve imperial victories while hiding the ruins of those absorbed into empire. Endurance, then, is never innocent. To last is also to dominate the field of memory. This may be why later powers so often restored, copied, or appropriated older monumental styles. A new regime wants the aura of old stone because old stone suggests inevitability. The new ruler claims continuity with a past already granted weight by endurance. Columns, axes, raised platforms, processional roads, megalithic mass, archaic forms. These become tools not simply of imitation, but of inherited authority. The structure need not speak clearly. Its age alone lends force. And so the ancient question becomes even more troubled. Why did humans build structures that last thousands of years? Not only because they wanted to remember, or to survive catastrophe, or to preserve relation with the dead and the sky. Sometimes they built to make their chosen order difficult to escape. Sometimes they built so that future generations would stand among stones and confuse endurance with legitimacy. But the story grows stranger here, because even the most powerful rulers could not fully control what their monuments would become. Dynasties fell, priests vanished, languages broke apart. And still the structures remained, slowly separating from the commands that created them, carrying fragments of lost technique no later empire could perfectly reproduce. Power can command labour. It cannot guarantee understanding. This is one of the quieter shocks hidden inside the ancient world. Some of the most enduring structures on Earth were built by human hands, using methods that archaeology can often reconstruct in outline, yet not always in full emotional or technical clarity. Stones were quarried, transported, lifted, aligned, fitted and finished through processes that scholars have studied with admirable care. Experimental archaeology has shown again and again that ancient engineering did not require fantasy, only intelligence, patience, coordination, and time. And still, something unsettles the modern mind when it stands before certain works and realizes that explanation, however plausible, does not always dissolve awe. The structure remains legible as human, yet strangely resistant to complete mental domestication. Perhaps that resistance is part of the answer. A society may build to preserve authority, ritual, memory, or cosmic order. But once its methods begin to fade, the structure acquires a second life. It becomes evidence not only of what was valued, but of what has been forgotten. Long-lasting architecture can survive as a rebuke to the fragile continuity of skill. This is difficult for modern cultures to admit, because there is a persistent temptation to imagine progress as a straight line, with later societies naturally understanding more than earlier ones. In many domains, that is broadly true. But in the history of building, transmission is uneven. Techniques disappear. Quarrying traditions end. Mortar formulas are lost. Precision stonework ceases under altered political, economic, or religious conditions. A civilization may inherit the ruins of one more ancient than itself, and find that admiration is easier than replication. This is not mysticism. It is history. Roman concrete, for example, survived marine environments with a resilience that modern scientists have only more recently begun to understand in detail. Ancient masonry traditions in different regions achieved astonishing durability, not because they possessed supernatural knowledge, but because they refined materials in close relation to local geology, climate, and use. In the Andes, polygonal stone fitting reached a level of seismic resilience that still commands respect. In Egypt, quarrying, transport, and placement at monumental scale reveal a command of organisation and craft that modern viewers often underestimate precisely because the final forms appear so still. The stillness conceals the living intelligence once required to produce it, and intelligence, when not carefully transmitted, vanishes. This may be one reason ancient structures were built to last in the first place. A durable building does not only preserve functional meaning, it preserves a trace of method. Joints reveal cutting logic. Orientation reveals surveying capacity. Tool marks reveal sequences of action. Even when the full process is lost, the structure continues to testify that a certain level of knowledge once existed. It does not explain itself completely, but it refuses the lie that the past was simple. Every long-enduring monument is, in this sense, a fossil of skill. That fossil quality creates a peculiar tension between archaeology and imagination. Scholars, rightly cautious, work from evidence. They test transport theories, map quarries, study labour organisation, examine wear patterns, analyse residues, compare inscriptions, and reconstruct stages of construction. Their work has corrected many exaggerated claims and has repeatedly shown that ancient builders were fully capable of impressive feats without needing mythical technologies. Yet the public imagination continues to drift toward mystery. This is not only because mystery is dramatic, it is because people feel, sometimes correctly, that a structure can be technically explicable and still existentially baffling. One may know how a block was moved and still not know why a society devoted itself to such work for generations, and there is another discomfort beneath that one. Sometimes the structure remains while the ecosystem of knowledge that produced it disappears almost entirely. Later generations may quarry from the ruins, imitate their outer forms or tell stories about the old builders, yet no longer command the exact same union of skill, labour, material familiarity and worldview. The monument survives as both inheritance and accusation. It asks a painful question without words. If this was made by humans, why can humans standing here now no longer do it in quite the same way? The answer is rarely that the ancients possessed magic. More often, it is that knowledge depends on continuity of institutions, incentives, apprenticeship and belief. Remove those, and capacity thins. A king who can mobilize thousands for ritual or dynastic reasons builds differently from a later society with different priorities. A lineage of stoneworkers passing methods through generations preserves subtleties no isolated observer can recover from finished surfaces alone. A temple economy tied to sacred calendars can support forms of precision that disappear once the cult collapses. What looks from a distance like lost genius may often be lost context. Yet lost context is no small thing. It may be the central wound running through the history of durable architecture. Because once context dies, the surviving structure becomes vulnerable to projection. A later empire may claim it. A new religion may reinterpret it. A tourist age may aestheticize it. Fringe theories may turn it into proof of forbidden worlds. Academic institutions may narrow their language until the monument feels over-explained and underfelt at the same time. In every case, something strange happens. The structure endures physically, but its method and inward atmosphere become battlegrounds. People argue over how it was built because the question of method often hides a deeper question about human inheritance. Are modern people the natural heirs of the past, or have there been breaks so severe that even ordinary human skill can become alien to its descendants? This question grows sharper at sites where later civilizations built among older stones they did not fully originate. Reused foundations, appropriated temples, copied masonry styles, restored monuments whose earliest phases were already ancient. These patterns suggest that the ancient world itself was full of people living among remains that exceeded their own moment. They too experienced the past as layered and partially inaccessible. They too may have looked at older works and felt uncertainty about origin. The sensation modern observers often treat as uniquely ours may have been familiar for millennia. Every civilization may have inherited some degree of technical ghostliness from the one before it. If that is true, then building to last was also a way of sending expertise into an uncertain future. Not complete instructions, perhaps, but durable evidence that a certain union of mind, hand, and order once existed. Even stripped of manuals and names, the monument carries this message stubbornly. Someone knew how to do this. Someone trained others. Someone repeated the sequence enough times to make refinement possible. Someone trusted stone as a medium through which knowledge could survive its own teachers. But survival is not preservation in any pure sense. Techniques stored only in finished results are always at risk of becoming opaque. The structure lasts, but the living chain breaks. And once the living chain breaks, later ages are left with surfaces, measurements, fragments, and wonder. They can approach the truth. Sometimes they can come very close. Yet complete recovery may remain impossible because knowledge is never only information. It is embodied timing, shared assumptions, social permission, ritual setting, and repeated touch. This may be why long-lasting ancient structures often seem to hover between confidence and grief. They display mastery, yet also reveal how easily mastery can vanish. They stand as proof that endurance is possible, and proof that continuity is not. What survives in stone may be only the outer husk of a deeper intelligence that required a whole civilization to sustain it. Once that civilization is gone, the building remains like a shell after the animal is withdrawn, and shells attract new inhabitants. If ancient techniques survived only in fragments, then later cultures encountering old monuments would not merely admire them. They would reuse them, rename them, and fit them into new systems of meaning, allowing the structure to outlive not only its builders, but its original identity. A structure can survive its makers and still fail to keep its name. This may be one of the saddest truths in the long afterlife of ancient architecture. People often speak of monuments as if endurance were a kind of victory, as though lasting thousands of years were enough to defeat oblivion. But survival is stranger than that. A temple can remain while its god is forgotten. A tomb can endure while the bloodline it guarded dissolves into rumour. A ceremonial platform can hold its shape while the gestures once performed upon it become unreadable. Stone resists wind, rain, roots, and even conquest more stubbornly than flesh or speech. Yet it does not always preserve identity. It preserves presence first. Meaning comes later, and meaning is much easier to take. This is where ruins begin their second life. Once the original culture weakens, fragments of its built world remain exposed to new eyes. Those who inherit the landscape do not approach empty matter. They approach something visibly old, charged, and difficult to ignore. A collapsed sanctuary still marks a place as significant. A ring of standing stones still organizes horizon and ground. A giant terrace still suggests ascent. Even without full understanding, later people feel that these places are not ordinary. They may fear them, sanctify them again, quarry them, guard them, or weave new legends around them. The monument does not fall silent in any complete sense. It simply begins speaking another language. This process may have happened far more often than history can recover. Ancient societies were rarely born onto empty land. They inherited pathways, mounds, shrines, broken walls, worked stones, forgotten burials, and sacred hills already layered with memory. A people might settle near an older ruin and attach it to ancestors they never knew. A conquering religion might claim that an earlier temple had always anticipated its own truth. An empire might restore a venerable site, not out of historical honesty, but because the aura of age strengthens new authority. Such acts do not merely preserve architecture, they redirect it. The structure continues to endure, but its identity becomes contested terrain. That contest is not always malicious. Sometimes it is simply how continuity functions after rupture. A later community, lacking the original names and rights, still needs a way to live with the inherited monument. It must explain the stone somehow. It must decide whether they belong to the dead, to spirits, to kings, to giants, to former enemies, to saints, to gods, to demons, or to no one at all. Myth enters where documentation is thinned. Reverence mingles with improvisation. Over time, the new explanation settles, and what began as a response to uncertainty hardens into tradition. This is why so many ancient sites carry layers of incompatible meaning. A pagan shrine becomes a church. A burial mound becomes the hill of a hero. A ruined Roman structure becomes a quarry for a medieval wall and a source of local legend at the same time. Sacred wells acquire saints. Temples are rededicated. Processional routes are repurposed. In some places, the continuity is visible enough to trace. In others, it must be inferred from orientation, spolia, altered inscriptions, or the stubborn recurrence of ritual in the same geographic points. What remains constant is not the doctrine, but the location. Certain places keep being chosen, as though the endurance of the structure itself persuades each new age that something important already happened there and might happen again. One begins to realize that lasting architecture does more than preserve a past. It recruits futures. This may be why ruins so often feel more alive than complete explanations. A ruin leaves space for adoption. It cannot enforce its original meaning with perfect clarity, so it invites later powers to inhabit it. The surviving wall becomes a backdrop for another ceremony. The old platform holds a new throne. The abandoned sanctuary becomes the seed of a monastery, a fortress, a pilgrimage stop, a cemetery, or a nationalist symbol. What endures in stone acquires a peculiar political advantage. It can be reused without needing permission from the dead. There is, however, a darker side to this adaptability. Reuse can preserve a structure physically, while erasing the people who first made it. The monument remains admired, visited, photographed, fenced, studied, even loved, yet the original builders become abstractions. Their language is gone, their social world is flattened into labels, their motives are reduced to categories broad enough to fit into textbooks but too clean to convey the emotional thickness of lived belief. It is possible, then, for architecture to survive magnificently, while the civilization that raised it is remembered only in fragments, or worse, remembered through stories imposed by those who replaced it. That imbalance should trouble any honest reading of the past. Endurance is not neutral inheritance. It can also be appropriation across time. Rome offers an obvious example, not only because Roman ruins are famous, but because Rome itself built over, absorbed and reinterpreted earlier worlds. Temples rose on older sacred ground. Imperial forms consumed local landscapes. Later, Christian authorities then repurposed Roman structures in turn. Yet this pattern extends far beyond Rome. Across the ancient Mediterranean, the Near East, South Asia, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere, new orders repeatedly established themselves among older stones. Sometimes they honoured what came before, sometimes they suppressed it. Sometimes they did both at once, preserving the site while transforming its narrative. A monument's very durability made it too useful to abandon. Durability, then, may contain a paradox. The more physically lasting a structure is, the more likely it becomes to be captured by histories not its own. This may explain why ruins often produce such a complicated emotion. They are beautiful, but not peacefully so. They seem patient, yet wounded. They reassure modern visitors that something can outlast disaster, but they also remind them that outlasting disaster is not the same as outlasting reinterpretation. A broken colonnade still stands, but the rites it framed are gone. A stone chamber remains, but the cosmology that made darkness meaningful there may have vanished centuries ago. Ruins survive by accepting contamination from time. They continue, but not uncontested. And perhaps ancient builders sensed this more than is usually admitted. Some structures seem intentionally concealed, layered, sealed, or made difficult to access. Some were repeatedly rebuilt in the same place, as if location mattered more than preserving one exact form. Some may have been designed to hold a core of sanctity, even when outer meaning shifted. It is impossible to know how conscious any particular culture was of future appropriation. But once societies had already witnessed old sites being inherited and renamed, the possibility can hardly have been invisible. To build to last may have included, at least dimly, the knowledge that strangers would one day stand among the stones and speak another tongue. If that is true, then enduring architecture was always haunted by a question it could never fully answer. Is it better to survive in altered meaning, or to vanish with one's integrity intact? Ancient structures offer no clean reply. They survived because they could be reused, loved, plundered, sanctified anew, and bent into later systems. Their very openness to transformation kept them in the world. But every transformation leaves marks, and not all marks are gentle. Once a structure becomes available to new religious or political orders, the past is no longer merely inherited. It is edited. And when the editing becomes deliberate, when old gods are renamed, old symbols recarved, old meanings forbidden while the stones themselves remain, the monument enters an even stranger phase of life. Not ruin, not continuity, but controlled memory. Controlled memory may be more powerful than destruction. When later generations encounter an ancient structure, they face at least two options. They can tear it down and attempt to erase it completely, or they can leave it standing while changing what it means. The second path is often quieter, more sophisticated, and in some ways more unsettling. Total destruction declares hostility openly. Reinterpretation works from within. It allows the old stones to remain visible while their voice is gradually redirected. A temple can lose its god without losing its walls. A sanctuary can be renamed, purified, rededicated, and folded into a new sacred order. A monument once bound to one cosmology can survive physically, while becoming evidence for another. In this way, architecture that lasts thousands of years becomes the perfect instrument not only for remembrance, but for selective remembrance. This pattern appears again and again in human history. The transition from pagan sacred landscapes to Christian ones across Europe and the Mediterranean did not always proceed through simple annihilation. Certainly some statues were smashed, shrines desecrated, and cult sites condemned. But many older places were absorbed rather than obliterated. Temples became churches. Sacred springs were associated with saints. Feast days aligned with pre-existing ritual rhythms. Ancient columns were reused in Christian basilicas. The old material body of sanctity remained, but its explanation changed. What had once belonged to one order of the world was made to testify to another. The stone endured. The meaning was baptized. One can observe similar dynamics elsewhere under different religions, empires, and ideological systems. Conquerors often understand that visible continuity stabilizes power better than empty absence. A destroyed monument leaves a wound. A repurposed monument leaves a claim. It says in effect that the new order has inherited and surpassed the old. It does not fear the ancient place, it possesses it. This gesture is stronger than iconoclasm alone because it captures the prestige of age. The old structure now appears to have been leading all along toward the truth of its new rulers. This is why editing the past through architecture can be so difficult to detect. It does not always look like censorship. Often it looks like preservation, and preservation is morally disarming. People are grateful when a structure remains standing. They feel relief that weather, war, and neglect did not reduce it to dust. But survival under new interpretation comes at a cost. Inscriptions are removed or overwritten. Statues are recarved. Ritual access changes. Earlier stories become superstition, then heresy, then silence. Over time, the new use feels so natural that the older one becomes almost invisible, not because evidence never existed, but because the framework through which evidence is interpreted has already been disciplined. The monument stands before the eye, yet part of its history has been taught not to appear. Perhaps that is one reason ancient structures so often produce a sense of layered unease. They are not merely old, they are edited old. This editing can take many forms. At times it is theological. A sanctuary once devoted to local gods is recast as a site of saintly miracle. At times it is imperial. A conquered city's ceremonial architecture is absorbed into the victor's narrative of order. At times it is scholarly. Later institutions define which interpretations count as serious and which must remain beyond the boundary of acceptable history. Some of that boundary making is necessary. Without it, the past dissolves into fantasy. Yet institutions, too, are historical. They are shaped by the assumptions, anxieties, and power structures of their age. What gets excavated, funded, displayed, translated, emphasized, or dismissed is never entirely free of historical mood. This does not mean every official narrative is false. It means no surviving monument arrives before us untouched by mediation. A structure that has lasted thousands of years has almost certainly passed through many hands. Priests, rulers, destroyers, restorers, looters, surveyors, colonial administrators, museum curators, nationalist historians, tourists, and archaeologists. Each hand leaves a layer of framing. A wall may physically belong to antiquity, yet the story told around it may be medieval, imperial, colonial, or modern. Sometimes these layers enrich understanding. Sometimes they obscure it. Very often they do both simultaneously. The ancient building then becomes less like a frozen object and more like a long argument conducted in stone. This argument is especially intense where sacred legitimacy is involved. A religion or empire inheriting older monumental ground cannot always afford to admit that the sanctity of place preceded its own arrival. To do so might weaken claims of uniqueness or revelation. It may therefore reinterpret earlier presence as foreshadowing, corruption, demonic imitation, or primitive anticipation. The older structure is allowed to remain, but only after being subordinated to a new hierarchy of truth. In this way, architecture becomes a battlefield where the winner does not merely occupy space. The winner rearranges time, deciding which past leads meaningfully into the present, and which past must be treated as error. There is something deeply human in this impulse. Every civilization wants ancestry. Every system of belief wants roots deeper than yesterday. Long-lasting structures offer those roots visibly. They can be recruited into continuity even when the continuity is partly invented. A later power need not build from nothing if it can inherit the aura of old stone. It can place itself at the end of a line that may not truly belong to it, and most people will feel the claim before they critically examine it. Age itself persuades, and yet age can also resist. The monument, even when reinterpreted, never becomes perfectly obedient. Residual forms remain. Strange orientations persist. Buried foundations point to forgotten phases. Unexplained symbolism survives in corners too worn to erase. A church built over a temple may inherit unusual geometry. A fortress raised from a sanctuary may preserve ritual axes unintentionally. A saint's site may still draw offerings that feel older than doctrine. The past leaks through. It does not always speak clearly, but it refuses complete domestication. That refusal may be one of the reasons ancient structures continue to fascinate. They are never fully reduced to the story told about them. This is also where conspiracy begins to grow in the human imagination. When people sense that something older remains beneath the official layer, suspicion naturally follows. Sometimes that suspicion becomes extravagant and careless, inventing hidden civilizations or all-controlling institutions without adequate evidence. But not all suspicion is foolish. History gives abundant reason to believe that authorities do rename, repurpose, suppress, and reorganize memory. The challenge is to remain disciplined without becoming naive, open without becoming credulous. Between total trust and total fantasy lies a more difficult posture. To stand before the stones and admit that survival does not guarantee transparency. That admission changes the original question once more. Ancient humans may have built structures to last because they feared forgetting, desired cosmic order, honoured the dead, and legitimised rulers. But long duration also made these structures vulnerable to capture by those who came later. Their endurance guaranteed that they would become prizes in the struggle over memory. The longer a monument stood, the more likely someone would try to speak through it. And that effort to speak through stone could reach even deeper than theology or imperial authority. Some places were not only seen, approached and interpreted, they were heard. Their chambers shaped echoes, breath, chant, resonance, and silence. If memory can be edited through story, perhaps it can also be shaped through the body itself, through the way a structure teaches people to feel before they ever fully understand what they are being taught. Before a monument is understood, it is often felt. This may be one of the least discussed reasons ancient humans built structures to endure. Stone does not only hold shape, it holds atmosphere. It alters the behaviour of sound, shadow, temperature, and bodily movement. A narrow passage changes breathing. A high chamber delays an echo. A low ceiling presses thought inward. Repeated columns establish rhythm before the mind names it. Darkness makes the smallest light seem chosen. Even now, modern visitors entering ancient spaces often speak not first of theories, but of sensations. The place feels solemn, unnerving, expansive, compressed, hushed, watchful, or strangely alive. Such responses are not proof of supernatural power. They are proof that architecture acts directly on the body, and ancient builders may have understood this more intimately than later analytical language sometimes allows. If so, then some enduring structures were designed not only to preserve belief but to generate it. This does not mean belief in the crude sense of forcing a dogma into passive minds. It means creating conditions under which a person feels that ordinary reality has shifted. Ritual depends on threshold. A ceremony begins when the familiar is rearranged, when one leaves daily light, enters measured space, follows prescribed movement, hears a voice transformed by stone, watches smoke or sunlight move where it should not seem to move by chance. The architecture does not merely contain the rite, it participates in it. It prepares the nervous system for attention, reverence, fear, surrender, or altered perception. A space that can do this reliably across generations has unusual power. It becomes an instrument for shaping inner life. There are many clues that ancient societies recognize this, even if they did not describe it in modern acoustic or psychological terms. Megalithic chambers, subterranean sanctuaries, hyperstyle halls, cave shrines, processional avenues, resonant temples, all suggest more than practical enclosure. Certain spaces amplify chant, others muffle the world outside. Some produce standing waves or particular echo qualities that scholars and experimental researchers have explored with increasing interest. Not every claim in this area is equally persuasive, and romantic exaggeration is common. Yet the broader idea is difficult to dismiss. Ancient architecture often behaved like a sensory technology. This may help explain why durable sacred structures were so often built from heavy material rather than lighter, more convenient alternatives. Stone stabilizes resonance differently. It carries thermal inertia. It creates darkness that feels denser than darkness in wood. It allows carving, enclosure, and permanence. In combination, softer materials cannot sustain for long. Above all, it grants repetition. The same acoustic chamber, the same reverberation, the same narrow threshold, the same procession can recur for centuries. What oral tradition might distort, the room itself can reinforce. The building trains the body through reliable experience. And experience is often more persuasive than doctrine. A person may doubt a statement. It is harder to doubt a sensation that arrives through one's own breath, skin, hearing, and orientation. When a beam of light reaches an inner chamber only at a certain time, when chant swells unexpectedly inside a stone vault, when drums or footsteps pulse through a corridor designed to gather resonance, meaning does not remain abstract. It becomes embodied. This is especially important in largely oral cultures, or in cultures where the deepest layers of initiation, priestly knowledge, or sacred presence were not meant to be fully disclosed through ordinary language. The architecture could communicate what speech was forbidden, insufficient, or too fragile to carry alone. In this sense, long-lasting structures may have functioned as repositories of controlled experience. They did not simply store objects, inscriptions, or remains. They stored states of perception. This idea casts certain ancient sites in a subtly different light. A passage grave aligned with the solstice is not only a memorial device or cosmological statement, it is a timed event chamber. A temple with graduated courts and increasingly restricted inner spaces does not only represent hierarchy, it makes hierarchy felt in the body through delay, separation, anticipation, and the narrowing of access. A cave sanctuary does not merely hide ritual from the outside. It changes air, sound, and visual certainty, allowing human attention to become unusually susceptible to symbol and suggestion. None of this requires cynical manipulation. Communities may have experienced such states as genuine contact with the sacred. Yet that does not lessen the architectural intelligence involved. The structure made contact possible by shaping conditions under which contact seemed, or felt, real. One begins to suspect that durability mattered here because these experiences were too valuable to trust to improvisation. If a society believed that certain sounds, lights, movements, or sequences opened access to ancestors, gods, cosmic harmony, or communal cohesion, then preserving the exact environment would become essential. A wooden hall might rot, shift, burn, or lose its resonance. A stone chamber, properly maintained, could reproduce the necessary conditions over lifetimes. The monument thus becomes not only a memorial or a statement, but an operating system for recurring transformation. Still, this possibility introduces another discomfort. If a structure can reliably produce awe, submission, or altered consciousness, then it can serve both liberation and control. It can bind a scattered people into a shared reality, but it can also intensify the authority of those who control entry, timing, and interpretation. A priest who knows when the chamber will fill with light, or how sound behaves in the sanctuary, occupies a powerful role. A ruler who stages revelation in an acoustically engineered hall may appear accompanied by forces greater than politics. The body, once moved, does not always ask who arranged the movement. This is why the boundary between sacred experience and institutional power is so difficult to trace in the ancient world. The two may have been inseparable, not because ancient people were naive, but because human experience itself is inseparable from environment. To enter a place is to enter a design. To repeat a ceremony is to repeat a spatial script. Over time, the script can feel natural, even eternal, precisely because the building endures while individuals change. One generation teaches the next not only what to believe, but where to stand, where to listen, where to wait in darkness, where the voice returns differently, where the silence thickens. The monument shapes conviction before argument begins. Perhaps this explains why certain ruins still feel charged even after their religions have faded. The explicit system of interpretation may be gone, but the sensory grammar remains partially intact. Visitors lower their voices without being told. They pause at thresholds. They look upward where design tells the neck to bend. They feel unease in spaces originally meant to unsettle or purify. The building's old intelligence still acts, even when its doctrine is dissolved. Endurance preserves not only stones, but habits of perception, and yet these habits are also fragile. Once a site is damaged, overexposed, reconstructed poorly, filled with tourists, stripped of ritual context, or translated into museum language alone, much of its experiential power may flatten. The structure remains, but the sequence of bodily encounter changes. This too is a form of historical loss, subtle but profound. What disappears is not only information but atmosphere, the precise mingling of movement, sound, darkness and expectation through which meaning once entered the human frame. So the question widens again. Ancient humans may have built structures that last thousands of years because they wanted to preserve memory, power, sacred order, and technical mastery. But perhaps they also wanted to preserve an effect, a way of making future bodies feel what words could never fully secure. A monument that can still command breath, silence, awe, or dread after its builders are gone has achieved a kind of victory beyond material survival. Yet once such effects are preserved in stone, another puzzle emerges. Similar monumental instincts, burial, alignment, elevation, enclosure, acoustic depth, ceremonial geometry, appear in distant cultures separated by oceans and time. Were these only parallel inventions born from shared human needs? Or does their recurrence hint that the desire to build against forgetting is older, wider, and more connected than the surviving record comfortably admits? It is difficult to stand before distant monuments from distant civilizations and not feel the temptation of a single hidden thread. Across the world, people who never shared a language, who never sailed the same seas, who never bowed to the same rulers, still raised mounds, cut chambers, aligned stone with sky, built elevated platforms, enclosed sacred interiors, and gave extraordinary durability to places associated with death, power, memory, or cosmic order. The repetition is not exact. It would be careless to flatten Egypt into Mesoamerica, Anatolia into the Andes, the British Isles into the Indus world, or Pacific ritual landscapes into those of the ancient Mediterranean. Each tradition emerged within its own ecology, materials, social structure, and symbolic vocabulary. Yet even with those differences fully respected, the recurrence remains haunting. Humanity, in many corners of the earth, kept arriving at the same broad instinct. When something mattered beyond one lifetime, it was given weight, orientation, enclosure, and endurance. One explanation is the simplest. Human beings everywhere confront mortality, weather, uncertainty, ancestry, and the sky. Similar bodies under similar existential pressures may generate similar architectural responses. Burial chambers protect the dead. Elevated places dramatize distance from ordinary life. Stone outlasts wood. Circular gathering spaces help communities perform repetition. Celestial alignment helps regulate ritual and season. None of this requires hidden contact or vanished master civilizations. It requires only that humans are human and that certain fears and hopes return wherever they are given time to deepen. And yet the simplicity of that answer does not fully dissolve the unease, because the recurrence is not merely practical, it is symbolic in strangely convergent ways. Mountains are imitated in architecture, thresholds are dramatized, inner chambers are hidden, the dead are brought into relation with light, direction, or elevation. The center of a sacred structure is often hard to access, sometimes reserved, sometimes dark, sometimes timed to events not visible every day. The outer form may differ, but the underlying grammar feels familiar. It is as though many ancient cultures, while speaking different civilizational languages, were still composing variations on a small number of very old themes: ascent, return, burial, alignment, enclosure, recurrence, silence. Comparative mythology has long noticed similar patterns in narrative: floods, underworld journeys, world mountains, sacred centers, destruction and renewal. Architecture may be the stone counterpart of the same tendency. If a society imagines the cosmos as layered, then its temple may become a vertical map. If it imagines death as a passage, then its tomb may become a corridor. If it imagines time as cyclical, then its ceremonial site may bind itself to solstice, equinox, moon, or star. The built world begins to mirror deep structures of thought. When many societies independently face the same great mysteries, perhaps their monuments begin to rhyme. But rhyming is not the same as innocence. There have always been more controversial interpretations circling this subject. Some have suggested forgotten transoceanic contact earlier than accepted history usually allows. Others have imagined diffuse priesthoods, antediluvian knowledge systems, or deep civilizational inheritance from worlds now lost beneath sea or sand. Many such theories outrun the evidence. They often collapse distinctions, ignore chronology, or treat every resemblance as proof of a single source. Serious historical work must resist that urge. Still, outright dismissal can become its own kind of laziness. Similarity deserves scrutiny, even when it does not justify grand conclusions. Not every contested idea is true, but the persistence of converging monumental logic across distant cultures remains a real and worthy mystery. Perhaps the most disciplined way to approach it is to ask what, exactly, travels most easily across time and separation. Not always people, not always full techniques, not always explicit doctrines. Sometimes what travels is pressure, the pressure of grief, the pressure of seasonal instability, the pressure of needing a center, the pressure of explaining the heavens, the pressure of making communal memory durable. These pressures can produce parallel inventions because they arise from the same human condition. If so, ancient architecture across the world becomes a distributed record of repeated existential problem-solving, one that looks eerily unified not because humanity had one hidden blueprint, but because certain answers become attractive whenever consciousness begins wrestling with duration. This possibility is, in its own way, more profound than a lost master culture. It suggests that monumental building is one of the recurring forms through which humanity tries to negotiate with impermanence. A people discovers that speech fades, timber rots, rulers die, and stories shift. Then it reaches toward weight. It chooses what can resist flame, wind, and forgetfulness. It marks a place, aligns it, fills it with the dead or the sacred, and thereby makes an argument. Something here must continue. That argument can emerge anywhere. And yet, even if one accepts broad human convergence, local mysteries remain. Why do certain forms appear in one region and not another? Why do some societies monumentalize the dead, while others monumentalize living rulership more aggressively? Why do some focus on subterranean chambers and others on ascending mass? Why are certain symbols repeated with uncanny insistence while others vanish? Why do some sites suggest patient communal labor across generations, while others imply concentrated command? Convergence explains part of the story, but not the whole story. The remaining differences are not noise. They are the fingerprints of distinct historical souls. This is where humility becomes essential. The modern observer is often caught between two unsatisfying extremes. One extreme reduces every monument to function, stripping away mystery until the ancient world feels emotionally dead. The other extreme dissolves all difference into fantasy, turning every stone into evidence of a secret civilizational web. Neither posture truly listens. The first underestimates ancient interiority. The second overprojects modern hunger for revelation. Between them lies a more difficult path, to recognize that recurring monumental instincts may reflect both universal human pressures and historically specific answers, some shared by contact, some shared by parallel need, some perhaps still not fully understood. Even the surviving record may be misleading. What has endured is not the totality of ancient architecture, but the most durable fraction of it. If countless structures of wood, earth, reed, and fibre once existed and vanished, then the visible similarities among surviving stone monuments may be amplified by preservation bias. The past that reaches the present is already filtered toward endurance. We may be comparing only those expressions of human culture that were most obsessed with lasting in the first place. That realization does not weaken the mystery, it sharpens it. Why did some communities feel the need to outlast time so intensely that their remnants now dominate our image of antiquity? Perhaps because those communities had already lost too much to trust anything softer. This thought returns like an old echo. The repetition of monumental instinct across the world may not simply reveal shared creativity, it may reveal shared trauma, or at least shared exposure to rupture. A people that has seen coastlines change, ancestors forgotten, sanctuaries destroyed, rituals interrupted, or social order collapse may not need direct contact with distant civilizations to arrive at similar conclusions. It needs only the realization that memory left to the living alone is perilously unstable. Stone, then, becomes less a luxury than a defense, not against death itself, but against a second death. The death of pattern, lineage, and meaning. If that is true, then the world's enduring monuments form a scattered archive of human distrust. Distrust of weather, distrust of rulers, distrust of oral continuity, distrust of the future's willingness to remember correctly. They are beautiful because they are disciplined. They are disciplined because something in the human past learned the cost of losing too much. And once that possibility is admitted, another, more controversial question steps out from the shadows. What if some structures lasted so long not merely because they were well built, but because they were intentionally designed by cultures who believed they were preserving fragments after an earlier collapse? Fragments of knowledge, orientation, or sacred order inherited from worlds already broken before recorded history fully began. There comes a point in any long meditation on ancient endurance when the mind drifts toward a more dangerous possibility. Not because the evidence is simple, it is not. Not because sensational answers are better than careful ones, they are not. But because certain questions keep returning with the stubbornness of old stones themselves. Why do some cultures seem to build as if they are preserving rather than inventing? Why do myths across different civilizations so often speak not only of origins, but of recoveries, restorations, renewed covenants, rebuilt temples, laws given again after destruction, sacred centers re-established after flood, fire, exile, or divine abandonment? Why does so much ancient memory seem to begin, not at the beginning, but after a break? The idea of civilizational reset has attracted both disciplined inquiry and reckless fantasy. In its most careless form, it becomes a stage on which every unexplained artifact is assigned to a vanished superculture with impossible technology. That temptation should be resisted. The ancient world does not need imaginary machines to be profound. Archaeology has repeatedly shown that human beings, working within real constraints, can achieve astonishing feats. And yet, when stripped of extravagance, the notion of rupture and partial recovery remains historically reasonable. Societies do collapse, knowledge does fragment, trade networks fail, specialist traditions disappear. Later generations inherit remnants they can use, admire, or ritualize without fully understanding their origin. This has happened many times within recorded history alone. It would be surprising if deeper prehistory were exempt from the same pattern. Perhaps the true mystery is not whether resets occurred, but how often human beings rebuilt under the illusion that they were beginning anew. A collapse does not need to be global to feel total to those who survive it. A region can lose its urban centres, priestly classes, writing systems, trade routes, or architectural traditions and experience that loss is the ending of a world. The Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean remains one example of how quickly complexity can unravel. Cities burned, kingdoms disappeared, literacy contracted in certain places, administrative systems failed. Survivors did not inherit nothing, but they inherited less than their predecessors possessed. They rebuilt amid debris, memory gaps, and political fragmentation. If such processes occurred repeatedly in different regions, then the long human habit of building durable structures may partly reflect an awareness, sometimes explicit, sometimes ancestral, that order is not guaranteed to continue. This possibility casts enduring monuments in a subtly altered role. They cease to be merely expressions of flourishing civilization. They become capsules against interruption. A structure meant to last thousands of years can then be understood as a wager placed by people who no longer trust continuity. Not because they foresee one specific disaster, but because they know enough about time to understand that systems fail. Oral transmission breaks, archives burn, priests die, dynasties lie. Rivers change course, coastlines sink, languages split. If so, the impulse to build in stone may sometimes have emerged not at the peak of confidence, but at the edge of anxiety. A monument says, if the living chain fails, let this remain. One can see hints of this mentality in cultures that repeatedly rebuild sacred sites on the same foundations. The persistence of place matters here. Even when the superstructure changes, the centre is maintained. A ruined sanctuary becomes the base of another. A mound is raised atop earlier mounds. A temple is renewed where an older cult once stood. This pattern can be explained by practical continuity, by land sanctity, by political appropriation, or by ritual inheritance. Yet it also suggests something more haunting. The location functions as a memory node, a point where fragments are gathered and reassembled after each break. The architecture does not always preserve everything. It preserves enough to start again. Ancient texts sometimes seem to remember this logic, though never in the tidy language modern readers may want. Mesopotamian traditions speak of kingship descending, being disrupted, and returning. Flood narratives preserve a world ended and restarted. Egyptian temple restoration inscriptions often frame rebuilding as the re-establishment of cosmic order after neglect or chaos. In South Asian traditions, time itself can unfold through cycles of decline and renewal. Mesoamerican cosmologies preserve ages of creation destroyed and remade. Greek thought also carried memories of vanished ages, lost wisdom, and catastrophic endings. None of these traditions prove one literal prehistoric master civilization, but collectively they do reveal something important. Many ancient cultures imagine the past as layered through repeated fracture. Humanity was not simply moving forward, it was recovering, forgetting, and recovering again. This is where controversial theories often enter, because the emotional structure of the evidence invites them. If monuments survive while explanations fail, if myths speak in fragments, if techniques vanish, if flood memories linger, if sacred centres are rebuilt over and over, then the imagination naturally asks whether some long-lasting architecture was intended as a bridge across deep amnesia. The disciplined historian must answer carefully. Perhaps in limited, local, historically grounded ways, yes. Beyond that, certainty collapses quickly. Still, even limited answers are powerful. A society does not need antediluvian machines to build against amnesia. It only needs the knowledge that amnesia is possible. And ancient people may have known that with painful intimacy. There is also a more intimate sense in which civilizational reset may operate, not only through flood or invasion, but through institutional takeover. A conquering empire can reset the meaning of a landscape. A new religion can reset sacred vocabulary. A scholarly canon can reset what counts as credible memory. In this sense, a monument becomes the contested remainder of multiple resets, not all of them geological or military. One age buries, another rededicates, another excavates, another nationalizes, another monetizes tourism around the site. Each reset changes what can be said. The structure survives, but the authorized interpretation shifts. Deep time is not only natural erosion, it is also repeated selection. This is why the question of hidden chapters in human history can be asked responsibly, without collapsing into fantasy. One need not claim knowledge of a lost global civilization. It is enough to admit that the surviving record is incomplete, that coastal prehistory is underrepresented because sea levels rose, that non-durable traditions vanished disproportionately, that many ancient sites were repurposed under new ideological systems, and that collapse repeatedly narrows what later ages can know with confidence. Under those conditions, the endurance of certain structures begins to look less like excess and more like strategy. The builders may not have known who would come after them, but perhaps they knew that someone would come after a break. And that, in its quiet way, is unsettling. It suggests that some of the world's most durable monuments may be messages from societies already living with the aftertaste of oblivion. Their greatness would then lie not in superhuman perfection, but in their refusal to trust historical continuity. They did not assume the future would understand them. They built anyway. They left weight, alignment, enclosure, and difficulty behind like clues for descendants they feared might inherit fragments instead of wholes. If so, then the ancient structure is not only a monument, it is a survivor. But survivors do not speak for themselves without mediation. They are found, interpreted, classified, fenced, translated, funded, doubted, protected, and sometimes softened to fit the intellectual needs of the present, which means the next mystery may not concern the builders alone. It may concern the modern systems that decide how those builders are allowed to be remembered. By the time an ancient structure reaches the modern world, it has already survived weather, conquest, theft, reinterpretation, neglect, and the long abrasion of centuries. But survival does not deliver it into neutral hands. It arrives instead within institutions. Museums, universities, ministries of culture, churches, heritage boards, archaeological missions, tourism industries, documentary media, and school systems all gather around the old stones with different languages and different desires. One seeks preservation, another seeks national prestige, another seeks scholarly caution, another seeks visitors, another seeks spiritual continuity, another seeks a usable past. None of these motives are simple, and none are entirely free from power. This is why the modern afterlife of ancient architecture can feel so strangely divided. The structure itself may be remote, silent, and patient, yet the world around it is full of voices deciding what it is allowed to mean. That decision is rarely total, but it is never trivial. Archaeology, at its best, is one of humanity's most disciplined acts of humility. It kneels before fragments and refuses to invent more than the evidence can bear. It sifts soil, dates charcoal, traces walls, compares ceramics, reads inscriptions, measures erosion, studies pollen, maps collapse layers, and tries, patiently, to rescue reality from wishful thinking. Without such discipline, the ancient world would become little more than a mirror for modern fantasies. And yet archaeology is also a historical institution. It emerged through empires, patronage systems, nationalist projects, colonial extractions, and intellectual fashions that shaped what was excavated, what was ignored, what was exported, and what was considered worthy of explanation. The science is real. The context around the science is also real. This tension matters because ancient structures do not simply wait to be discovered. They are selected for discovery. Some sites receive decades of funding, conservation, and public storytelling. Others remain understudied, inaccessible, politically inconvenient, or physically endangered. Some interpretations become standard because they fit established models elegantly. Others linger at the edge because the evidence is incomplete, because they sound too speculative, or because they complicate institutional habits of thought. Often this caution is justified, but sometimes the desire for stability and knowledge can become its own quiet filter, rewarding interpretations that preserve order and sidelining those that expose deeper uncertainty. the result is not necessarily deception. More often it is something subtler. The past is made legible in ways that current systems can comfortably manage. Ancient monuments are especially vulnerable to this because they are so symbolically powerful. A state may present them as proof of uninterrupted national greatness, even when the populations, languages, and religious systems surrounding them changed many times. A religious institution may emphasize those phases of a site that support sacred continuity and quietly diminish those that do not. A museum may isolate artifacts from landscape and ritual, turning lived architecture into aesthetic object. Academic writing may grow so careful that the emotional strangeness of a monument is flattened into neutral terminology. Popular media may swing the other way, inflating uncertainty into melodrama. Between over-control and over-fantasy, the old stones are repeatedly translated into the needs of the present. One might ask whether this is avoidable. Perhaps not entirely. Every age approaches the past through its own questions, but it remains important to notice how much those questions determine what kind of ancient humanity becomes visible. A civilization obsessed with measurement will foreground engineering. One obsessed with religion will foreground cosmology. One obsessed with identity will foreground ancestry and ownership. One suspicious of institutions will foreground suppression. One intoxicated by mystery will foreground hidden knowledge. None of these perspectives is wholly false. Each catches something real, yet each also risks shrinking the monument to fit a preferred story. The structure lasts. Interpretation circles around it like weather, wearing grooves into public understanding. This becomes especially sensitive when monuments are entangled with colonial history. Many of the most famous ancient sites were documented, excavated, classified, or displayed under conditions of unequal power. Artifacts were removed. Local traditions were dismissed or romanticized. Indigenous and regional relationships to the sites were sometimes subordinated to foreign academic authority. Even when modern scholarship works to correct those legacies, the older frameworks do not disappear overnight. They linger in naming, ownership disputes, exhibition practices, tourist economies, and assumptions about who gets to speak credibly for the past. The monument then becomes a meeting point not only of ancient time, but of modern asymmetry. And still, one should be careful not to turn all scholarly caution into repression. Much of what is dismissed as suppressed history is simply unsupported. There is dignity in saying that the evidence does not permit a claim. Ancient structures deserve better than careless myth-making imposed upon them. Yet skepticism, too, can become lazy when it's applied mechanically, as though anything emotionally potent or institutionally inconvenient must be false by default. The most honest posture may be more difficult than either certainty or sensationalism. It requires accepting that the record is partial, that institutions are imperfect, that some mysteries are genuine, and that disciplined curiosity must remain open without surrendering itself to fantasy. That is perhaps the hardest lesson the old monuments offer the modern world. They survive in a condition of incomplete legibility. They are not blank, but neither are they transparent. They demand study, but they also resist final capture. Every excavation reveals and disturbs. Every reconstruction clarifies and interprets. Every publication stabilizes and narrows. Knowledge advances, yet some part of the ancient structure always remains slightly beyond the frame, not because truth is impossible, but because time has damaged the archive beyond complete repair. The missing pieces matter as much as the surviving ones. Coastal settlements now underwater, timber sanctuaries long vanished, oral cosmologies unrecorded, rites interrupted by conquest, priestly lineages extinguished, foundations still buried beneath later construction. These absences shape what modern history can say. A durable monument may dominate the landscape of evidence simply because everything softer around it disappeared. The surviving stone is then burdened with disproportionate explanatory weight. It becomes the representative of a world that was once far richer, more varied, and perhaps more internally conflicted than the record allows. Modern systems often speak confidently, because they must organise public knowledge somehow. But the old structures, if looked at patiently, keep returning the same quiet warning. What survives is not all that was. Perhaps that is why these monuments continue to unsettle, even in an age of scanning, dating, satellite imaging, and digital reconstruction. The more precisely they are measured, the more one senses the scale of what measurement cannot recover. A floor plan may be mapped in full, yet the fear that once entered its threshold is gone. A quarry source may be known, yet the lost songs that coordinated labour are gone. An alignment may be calculated, yet the first astonishment of those who saw the light arrive is gone. Institutions preserve, classify, and explain. They also stand at the edge of irretrievability. So the question of why ancient humans built structures that last thousands of years cannot be answered only by looking backward. It must also be asked in relation to the present. What do modern systems do with things that refuse to vanish? Do they listen? Do they simplify? Do they recruit old stone into new stories? Do they protect mystery where mystery is honest, and reject invention where invention becomes noise? Or do they, like every power before them, arrange the past into forms that make the current world feel more stable than it truly is? That question leaves a final unease behind it. If the monuments survived because ancient people feared forgetting, then perhaps their deepest lesson is not about them alone. Perhaps it is about the recurring human desire to believe that the version of history currently authorized is the final one, and perhaps the oldest stones remain standing precisely to remind later civilizations how often that confidence fails. In the end, the oldest structures may be less like answers than like acts of refusal. They refuse weather, though not forever. They refuse oblivion, though not completely. They refuse the brevity of the bodies that raised them, and perhaps this is why they continue to trouble the imagination more deeply than many written histories ever could. A text can argue. A monument simply remains. It does not plead its case. It does not explain itself to every age that approaches it. It stands in sand, in wind, in jungle shadow, beneath mountain cold, beneath the slow turning of stars. And by standing there, it asks a question no civilization has fully escaped. What does a mortal species believe is worth protecting from time, if it knows time will eventually take almost everything? That question may be the true foundation beneath all long-lasting architecture. Ancient humans were not unique in fearing death. Every generation fears death. What seems more unusual is the scale of their response to disappearance. They did not merely mourn the dead, praise rulers, measure the sky, or sanctify land. They repeatedly converted anxiety into permanence. They took grief, memory, power, orientation, and sacred order, and translated them into materials that could survive the soft collapse of language. The result was never perfect. Meaning slipped, rituals ended, priests vanished, empires repurposed what they inherited. Scholars reconstructed fragments and argued over the rest. Still, the structures endured long enough to cross cultural death after cultural death, carrying remnants of old intentions into futures their builders could not imagine. Perhaps that alone reveals something essential about the human condition. Humans do not only want to live, they want continuity to live through them. They want the pattern to continue after the breath stops. A child may inherit a name, a priest may inherit a right, a king may inherit a throne. But all these chains are fragile. Ancient builders seem to have understood this with unusual clarity. Bloodlines break, oral traditions drift, archives burn. Memory can be edited by power or thinned by neglect. Stone, though not immortal, resists these betrayals longer than most things the human hand can shape. To build in stone was therefore to push back, gently but stubbornly, against the humiliating truth that consciousness leaves almost no natural trace. And yet the deeper irony remains. The structures lasted. The certainty did not. No monument, however durable, has managed to travel into the present carrying its complete, original world intact. The old buildings arrive before later ages damaged, translated, appropriated, admired, fenced, doubted and loved from distances their makers never intended. In one sense, then, the ancient project failed. If the goal was to preserve exact meaning, time proved more patient than stone. But in another sense, the project succeeded in a stranger and perhaps more profound way. These structures still provoke reverence, suspicion, longing, and philosophical unrest. They still force human beings to look beyond utility and ask why anyone would build so heavily unless the burden being carried was heavier still. The monument survives not as a sealed answer, but as an enduring disturbance. Maybe that was always enough. A culture may never be able to guarantee what future generations will understand. It may only be able to leave behind a form so persistent that forgetting becomes incomplete. The temple loses its god, yet the chamber still creates silence. The tomb loses its body, yet the passage still gathers shadow. The platform loses its ruler, yet the elevation still teaches the eye to look up. Something of the original force remains, not as doctrine, but as pressure. The building continues to shape human response even after the language surrounding it has shattered. In that sense, the most lasting monuments were not designed only to communicate ideas. They were designed to outlast the failure of ideas by preserving orientation, mood, and gravity itself. This may be why the question of why ancient humans built for thousands of years cannot finally be solved by engineering, politics, religion, or astronomy alone, though all of these belong to the answer. Beneath every specific motive lies a more ancient unease. Humans seem to know, at some deep level, that life passes too quickly for meaning to feel secure. The seasons return, but the witnesses do not. Children inherit landscapes already filled with the dead. Civilizations mistake themselves for permanent until drought, invasion, plague, flood, or internal decay strips the illusion away. Against that horizon, a long-lasting structure becomes almost like a vow spoken to the future. Not that memory will survive untouched, but that it will not surrender without resistance. There is something tender in that resistance, even where power distorted it. Kings used monuments to naturalize authority. Priesthoods used them to regulate access to the sacred. Empires used them to rewrite the past. Institutions used them to stabilize public memory. All of this is true. Yet underneath those uses there remains a more vulnerable impulse. Someone feared that what mattered might disappear. Someone believed that weight, alignment, and endurance could hold a fragment of order in place a little longer. Someone decided that transience, left unanswered, was too cruel. The most haunting possibility is that ancient builders were not only speaking to descendants, they were speaking to silence itself, to place a stone where storms would strike it for centuries, to orient a chamber toward a recurring light, to bury the dead in architecture stronger than homes, to raise sanctuaries whose inner darkness would remain cool after dynasties were gone. These acts feel almost like negotiations with the void, not victories over it. Not delusions that mortality could be abolished, more like acknowledgements that if human life cannot endure, perhaps relation can endure, a place can endure, a pattern can endure, a gesture can be repeated by strangers who no longer know the first names attached to it. That may be the nearest thing to immortality a historically minded species can honestly attempt. And this, perhaps, is why the oldest monuments still seem awake. Not literally, but in the way certain presences remain difficult to reduce. They stand through changes in language, faith, and empire without fully consenting to any of them. Each age tries to explain them, inherit them, regulate them, or soften them into familiarity. Yet some remainder always escapes. A corridor still darkens too completely. A block still feels too deliberate. A ruin still keeps the horizon in an old alignment. A buried foundation still hints at a phase no surviving narrative can completely recover. The structure remains like a thought that history has not finished thinking. Perhaps the builders understood less than modern people sometimes imagine. Perhaps they understood more. Perhaps they were simply human enough to recognize that memory is a fragile animal, easily scattered, and that the future is not a safe place for truth. So they entrusted what they could to the mountain, to the bedrock, to the patient weight of quarried earth. They built for the dead, for the gods, for rulers, for ritual, for calendars, for fear, for continuity, for authority, for hope. But underneath all those motives there may have been one quieter than the rest. The wish that when their voices were gone, the world would still contain one place where forgetting had not entirely won. And so the stones remain, not closing the mystery, only deepening it. They wait in moonlight and noon glare, in tourist noise and midnight wind, carrying the marks of hands that vanished long before the first surviving explanations of them were written. They do not ask to be believed, they ask to be stood before. And in that stillness, a final unease begins to gather, softly, almost gently, that perhaps every civilization, no matter how certain of its records, laws, technologies, and institutions, is always only one long forgetting away from needing to build this way again.